All right, so we're going over who is Melchizedek. So this is a character from the Old Testament, but he's very enigmatic because he like shows up in like certain parts of the Bible, and then he's gone, and then he's back again. It's a weird thing. So from the Bible, so to start off, we know Melchizedek is mentioned twice in the Old Testament. So Genesis 14, and I think it's like Psalm 110. So just randomly, like in the middle, and then all of a sudden back again in the book of Hebrews. So the biblical writers kind of act like we should know who he is, right? Like, oh yeah, this guy Melchizedek, and then we're here like, what the heck are you talking about, right? So that's kind of one of the big challenges. Melchizedek, the name Melchizedek means king of righteousness, or maybe like righteous king, or perhaps my king is just. So it's perhaps just a title, right? It might not even be his name. It might just be like the righteous king did X, Y, and Z, right? So all kinds of things that we don't know, but that's what we're exploring. Can somebody? So I'll how well can you read that? Can someone read that? Can someone read? Let's say half of it, like up to hand, and then someone read the rest.
After his return from the defeat of whoever that guy is and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High, and he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand."
Can someone read the rest of it?
And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself." But Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I've lifted my hand to the Lord, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich. I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten, and the share of the men who went with me. Let Aner, Eshel, and Mamre take their share."
Yeah. So there's the story of how Abram is like caught in the middle of this giant war between a whole bunch of kings, and at the end of it, there's this king named Melchizedek who blesses Abram, and Abram just gives him a tenth of everything he owns. Right? Sounds like a tithe, but he doesn't give to all these other kings. And so, why is this in the Bible? Like all that stuff. Probably people were wondering that like from the very beginning, right? Yeah, so Melchizedek gets a tenth of the spoil. Now, because it's a tenth, right, in later, Jewish tradition, it becomes, in the Torah, right, it becomes a tithe, and a tithe is, giving to God, right? And so, in a sense, like, is this saying that Melchizedek is, like, a proper priest to be given a tithe, right? Like, we give a tithe to our church because we believe it's a real church. Is Abram giving a tithe to Melchizedek because he's somehow representing the true worship of God, right? Interesting kind of thing. Melchizedek is the king of Salem. So Salem is Jerusalem. This is kind of the etymology of it. So in Psalm 76, it says, "His abode has been established in Salem, his dwelling place in Zion." So this is a common thing in Hebrew poetry where you'd say something one way and the exact same thing another way right afterwards. So he says, his abode has been established in Zion, right? Zion meaning the mountain where Jerusalem sits, and his abode has been established in Salem, so the same place, right? So that's a strong equivalence between the two. From the Amarna letters, so this was a group of letters to the Pharaoh when they excavated like in Egypt, and they found all these letters that were given from like different kings in the ancient Near East in the 14th century BC, which is super cool. So we have these letters this mail that this guy from the Pharaoh received, and it's really a wealth of information that we get from the Amarna letters. But from the Amarna letters from Abdi Heba to Pharaoh in circa 14th century, he mentions a place called Shalim or Salem, which later on, right, is turned into Urushalim. That Uru means like city, so the city of Salem, and then eventually that turns into Yerushalem, and then eventually Yerushalayim, which is in Hebrew what we call Jerusalem. So that's kind of how Salem turns into Jerusalem. So the city of peace is Salem. So that demonstrates how old the roots of Genesis 14 and Psalm 76 really were. So eventually, right, the name Salem was completely forgotten, right? Like, we don't know what Salem is, but it shows that there was a witness, right, to what Salem was, what Jerusalem was, let's say, 2000 BC, right? Go ahead.
14th century
BC. So 1300s BC. Yeah. Yeah. Good. God Most High, or El Elyon, or Yahweh. So apparently he has been, so we're going to get into that. So this right here, what we're about to go over, to me, is completely mind-blowing. But it involves, like, archaeology and linguistics and all kinds of stuff. And so please, please, please stop me and ask questions, because I'm likely to skip over some stuff. And if I do, then you might not get any of it, right? Okay, so El Elyon is the name. So he says, Abram says, blessed be Abram by God Most High. God Most High in Hebrew is El Elyon. Now, the name El can either mean God or the Canaanite god of the sky, El, right? So it's either just a general name for a god, right? Or it's the Canaanite god of the sky, El, so like a very specific god. Right? Elyon means elevated or high. Now, El Elyon was used in Canaanite inscriptions worshiping the god El, right? So it was a title. Elyon was a title for the specific god El, a Canaanite god. Kind of crazy, right? We got that, right? So now, what exactly is Abram saying here, right? So is Abram saying, yes, this God that you worship is my God, right? Is he saying that the worship of El was perhaps like a shadow of the future worship of Yahweh that's to come, right? Or was he simply saying, yes, I worship the Most High God, El Elyon, who is in fact Yahweh, right? So is he just like appropriating the title El Elyon for God, right? El Elyon can be said, be called God Most High, or the specific God El, the exalted one, or something like that, right? Does that make sense? This is like crazy, right? Whatever the case, this hints that God has been worshipped in some way or another long before the Torah and long before even Abram, which is crazy, right? Because we often tell the story of Christianity as if like it began with Abraham, but is there some hint at the beginning of the Bible that there was a tradition of people who worshipped Yahweh, perhaps under a different name, from long before Abram? Who knows, right?
Well, that was Melchizedek.
Melchizedek, right? So Melchizedek says, blessed be Abram by El Elyon. Abram says, I have lifted my hand to Yahweh, comma, El Elyon, or the Lord, God Most High, right? So he takes this title that's used for the Canaanite god El and just appropriates it directly without changing it at all and uses it for Yahweh, our God, right? So Abram clarifies what Melchizedek says to identify his God with Melchizedek. So your God, whatever you call him, is my God, right? Anyway, really interesting. So the argument that I'm kind of following here comes from this book, The Early History of God. This is by Mark Smith, who was a Princeton Theological Seminary professor. He's a Christian, by the way. And then also Patrick Miller, who wrote an article called El, the Creator of Earth. So I'm going to read, actually somebody read the blue stuff.
To the earth shall fall the strong, to the dust the mighty. Scarce had the words left her mouth, or her speech left her lips, as she uttered her voice. Under the throne of Prince Yan said, Kutharwa passes. I tell thee, O Prince Baal, I declare, O rider of clouds, now your enemy, O Baal, now your enemy you will smite, now you will cut off your adversary, you will take your eternal kingdom, your everlasting dominion.
Yeah, so this is from what's called the Baal cycle, which is a myth about how the Canaanite god Baal, who we see all over the Old Testament, defeated the god of the sea, Yam, because the god of the sea with his friend Motu, who's the god of the dead, right, of the underworld, swallowed him up, right? And Anatu, who's the god of love and war in the Canaanite pantheon, helped Baal smite the king, and basically, the death is like a giant dragon monster thing, and so she tore open the belly, and Baal came out, and that's the story of the seasons, right? Because the seasons, right, is where like rain and fertility dies, in fall and winter, and then it is raised again in spring. And so that's kind of the story of how we got seasons in, the Canaanite mythology. But notice, right, it says, like, when you're describing the god Baal, you call him the rider of the clouds. Like, that's the coolest thing about Baal. Like, that's what we call him. Can somebody read Isaiah 19:1?
Behold, the Lord is riding on a swift cloud and comes to Egypt.
How about Daniel 7:13?
And behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like the Son of Man.
And then one more, Psalm 68.
Sing to God, sing praises to his name, lift up a song to him who rides the clouds.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. The same title that's used for Baal is used for Yahweh. So what's happening, right? So when people were praising Baal, they like to call him, the one that rides the clouds, which is it's an awesome image. It looks really cool. So fair enough, right? But when the Bible or Yahweh worshipers wanted to worship Yahweh, they took that same language and used it for the true God, right? They said, see, our God is so great that he does all the things that your God does and more, right? So that's the whole idea, right? Your God rides on the clouds. No, my God rides on the clouds, and he's so much better than your God, right? Et cetera, right? In fact, like that's the whole gist of the competition between Elijah and the prophets of Baal. It's like, okay, your God is just sleeping in heaven. He's tired, he can't bring fire down on this altar, but then God just immediately scorches it, even though there's like water all over it. Water all over it. Right? So this leads to assimilation. So eventually, the image of God riding on the clouds loses all memory of being associated with another God, which is total assimilation. So that's when, basically, over time, people keep on using the like rider of the cloud to refer to Yahweh, and eventually people stop even worshiping Baal entirely and forget he ever existed, but they still keep on calling Yahweh the rider on the clouds, right? And forget that it had anything to do with Baal in the first place, because it's awesome, and so why not call him that, right? So, like, there's a song called "The Days of Elijah." I don't know if you've heard it. Like, these are the days of Elijah, right? And like the chorus is, "Behold, he comes, riding on the clouds, shining like the sun," like at the trumpet call, right? And now, was Robin Marks in 1994 saying, "Yeah, see, Yahweh's so much better than Baal. He rides on the clouds"? Well, no, right? But over time, right, that same title, the one that rides on the clouds, becomes so associated with Yahweh that we forget it even had to do anything to do with Baal in the first place, right? So Yahweh alone rides on the clouds, and we've forgotten about Baal entirely. Go ahead.
Doesn't also relate to the fact that when Jesus ascended into heaven, he was ascended into the clouds. So
Right. There was one like a son of man, that with the clouds of heavens there came, right, one like the Son of Man. And so perhaps that is like in view of the ascension, right, is that when Jesus ascends into heaven, that he becomes the one like the Son of Man in Daniel 7, which perhaps originally they thought would mean something like an angel, but the one like a Son of Man eventually becomes to mean, Jesus himself. Right, good. Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions? So this is... can somebody read, this is called the Karatepe bilingual inscription. This is from the 8th century BC. So it's bilingual, which is like, like the Rosetta Stone had a bunch of different languages, and it was translated like a bunch of different ways, which was really helpful for us because we got to like learn to read these other languages by the translation. Anyway, can someone read this inscription?
If any person should damage the city or erase the name of Azitawada or place another man's name in his place, or destroy this inscription, they may Baal of heaven and El, creator/possessor of the earth, and the eternal Shamash, and the entire assembly of the sons of the gods strike him down. May they wipe out his kingdom, cut off his descendants, and blot out his name from the earth.
Yeah, so Baal of heaven, and then El, so Baal is obviously one of the Canaanite gods. Shamash is the god of the sun. El, creator/possessor of the earth, right? So that sounds really familiar to Genesis 14, right? And in fact, it's the exact same words. So in Hebrew, that's El Kone Aretz. So El, the god, either the Canaanite god El or a general name for a god, right? Kone, so this is the word for like to create or to possess, probably to create in this case, so creator of earth. Now, this is not the normal word for like to create. It's a weird word. Like it's not like the natural word you would usually use. Like in Genesis 1, they use the word bara, and in elsewhere they use the word asa. So those are like the two normal words for to create. But this is a weird one, right? And it's weird, I think, intentionally in order to echo, right, this El language. Like this, you say El created the earth. Now we say actually Yahweh created the earth. El Konear, and he is God, the creator of earth, right? And this is kind of a pun on El, which can both be the Canaanite god El and the name for a general god, right? So now Melchizedek blesses Abram by El Kone Aretz, perfectly normal Canaanite thing to say, right? And Abram says, blessed are you by Yahweh El Kone Aretz, right? There's also like a Hittite divine name called El Kanersha, which is also comes from El Kone Aretz. There's a bunch of names, right, that this is a well-established thing that people called the Canaanite god El, the creator of earth, right, El Kone Aretz, which now is being appropriated for the use of Yahweh himself, right? Any thoughts or questions on that?
How
Because
about, like, other names for God that in the Bible, like El Shaddai?
right, yeah, and there might be some broader Canaanite. I don't know off the top of my head whether, for instance, El Shaddai is a similar kind of situation, but I'm not sure. Yeah, so in other words, it seems like Melchizedek is blessing him by his God, and Abram is equating his God with Melchizedek's God, which suggests, right, perhaps that once we reach Genesis 14, we're seeing some part of the process of assimilation of the title El Elyon, creator of earth, into this description of God, such that Abram can say Yahweh, comma, El Elyon, right? Go ahead.
And like Bethel,
House of God. Right, and how much is that? And that's like an open question for Old Testament scholars, is how much is Bethel, right? Beth means house, right? House of God, right? General name for God, including Yahweh. Or how much of that is house of El, the god of the Canaanites. And eventually, people that worshipped Yahweh came into Bethel and appropriated that and called it the same as the house of Yahweh, right? Really interesting. Whatever the case, it seems that Yahweh accepts the worship of Melchizedek, whatever name he uses, even though he doesn't use the name Yahweh, and he uses the name El Elyon, which is steeped in Canaanite religion. For whatever reason, Yahweh accepts this worship, and it's not even just like Melchizedek's worship, because he seems to be a priest that represents a tradition that goes back, hundreds, thousands of years of worshiping El. And how much of that is acceptable to Yahweh and how much of it isn't? Well, we don't necessarily know, but there's some hint that some part of it is, right? Which is really interesting. So what do we make of this? Like, for instance, like, are there people, like, there's unreached peoples who've never heard of God. Is there some extent to which they've heard, God revealed in some way or another that we don't know about and that God accepts, right? Maybe he doesn't, like, obviously it'd be infinitely better for them to hear the gospel and really know Jesus through the Bible and through the Christian tradition, through God's community. But maybe because they simply have been given, we know in the Old Testament, in Matthew, right, Jesus says, much is expected of those to whom much is given, right? Like if you've been given the Torah, if you've been given the law, the prophets and everything, then much is expected of you. Does it make sense then to say that little is expected of those to whom little is given, right? If they're given very little information about God, maybe God has mercy on those people and accepts some part of their religion as acceptable to them, or that they're drawn to some part of it that leads them closer to Yahweh, even though it's not really the whole thing, right? I don't know. Like, it's an interesting thing that perhaps Melchizedek is pointing towards, but obviously that's such a small little part of the Bible that it's hard to, like, draw like major conclusions from it. Go ahead.
I forget somewhere, I think Paul in the New Testament is saying that there's no excuse.
Right.
That
Romans 1.
the Romans 1,
Yeah, so I'll read that.
yeah. That nature points to God, right?
Right, exactly, yeah. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since that what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since, and not necessarily through the Torah, not necessarily through the writings of the Bible, but instead, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. So in other words, you are without excuse for not having realized how to worship God, and perhaps not necessarily under the same name, not by worshiping Jesus Christ as a man who came down from heaven and died for us and for our salvation, right? But you should have known enough to know. And perhaps, right, this argument in Paul is made much stronger if there actually were people who managed to be drawn to God without ever having heard of the Bible, right? Which is, okay, and again, like this is tentative and speculative, but there's some evidence for it, right? Anyway, any other thoughts or questions? And obviously, this doesn't even remotely reduce the importance of missions. It doesn't remotely, everyone should hear about Jesus because Jesus is awesome, and he's going to make your life so much better because you're going to be filled with purpose. And why would you want to worship a pale shadow of God when you can worship God himself and Jesus Christ, right? Like, there's a million reasons to do missions, right? But perhaps this means that God is more merciful than we might have thought, right? Who knows?
Well, it's even like with Paul on Mars Hill, appealing to what
Right.
they
Already knew through Athens, right? Through Athenian.
Let me tell you about a warfare.
Yeah, exactly, right. Yeah, so Paul in Acts basically goes up to Mars Hill, which is like where actually trials were done in Athens, and he explains to them God in the form of, right, okay, you were worshiping this unknown God that you don't know about, right, but let me tell you who that God is, right? So explaining God in terms that they would understand, and that perhaps there was some little shadow of the God of Israel in Athenian religion. But again, ultimately everyone is saved through Christ. The question is, how exactly is that done? And that's kind of beyond us to say. Okay, good.
Start where people are at.
Okay, this is it dead? Might be dead. Sorry.
Need another clicker?
No, there it goes.
Okay.
Which slide are we on? This one?
Let me see if this works. Okay, so what makes Melchizedek important? Number one, he seems to have worshipped God or something like God long before Abraham did, and represents a tradition of doing so. So if he is a priest, which means that there's other people who do the same things that he does, or roughly the same things, right? Which means perhaps through history there have been more people than just Melchizedek who he represents. Second, Abraham gives a tenth of everything to Melchizedek, suggesting that Abraham recognizes this God in the same way that, like, if you give a tithe to Drainsville Church of the Brethren, well, you darn well better be sure the Drainsville Church of the Brethren is a church, right? In the same way, right, if Abram gives a tithe to Melchizedek, then maybe that means that he recognizes that this religion is valid in some way or another, right? Which to me is kind of comforting because it means that perhaps God, had revealed himself to people in ways that we don't know about before the Bible even starts recording things. Melchizedek is both a priest to El Elyon and a king, and this is largely prohibited in the Old Testament. So you were not allowed to both be a king and a priest, which means that Melchizedek, as a king, was super special and important, and we'll go over that. And then as king of Salem or Jerusalem, right? So in Judah, right, the capital of Israel is Jerusalem. This is really an important city, and the king who sits there is obviously the really important king. And insofar as he's an ideal king, he might be a prototype of the Messiah to come. Go ahead.
So, what are the Jews?
Yeah, we'll talk about in the intertestamental period, kind of some more Jewish writings about Melchizedek. Yeah. Now, I don't know much about what modern Jews think about Melchizedek, but in terms of like the Jewish tradition, yeah, it would be. Mm-hmm. Anyone else? Can someone read this 2 Chronicles passage?
But when he was strong, he grew proud to his destruction. For he was unfaithful to the Lord his God, and entered the temple of the Lord to burn incense on the altar of incense. But Azariah the priest went in after him, with 80 priests of the Lord who were men of valor. And they withstood King Uzziah, and said to him, It is not for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord, but for the priests, the sons of Aaron, who are consecrated to burn incense.
Yeah, so this king named Uzziah waltzes into the priests and waltzes into the temple and starts doing priest stuff, right? He starts burning incense and all that stuff, right? And this was a big no-no. You're not supposed to do this, right? Only the people who belong to the line of Aaron. So this is Numbers 18. They shall join you and keep guard over the tent of meeting for all the service of the tent, and no outsider shall come near you. So especially no kings can offer incense. No kings can do the job of a priest. That's a big bad thing to do. Perhaps this is like some kind of like separation of church and state, right? Where, if the king can start doing the things that priests do, then perhaps the king can sully the church or can sully the Yahwistic religion and turn it into something for himself, right? In fact, when we get to the book of Amos, right, the king there says something like, stop prophesying here. This is the king's temple and the king's sanctuary. In other words, right, you can't prophesy against the king because the king owns the temple, right? And that's perhaps what the Torah was trying to guard against. Can someone read 1 Samuel 13?
So Saul said, Bring the burnt offering here to me, and he offered the burnt offering. When he finished offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. Samuel said, What have you done? You have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God, with which he has commanded you.
So obviously, again, really big no-no. A king is not supposed to offer incense, is not supposed to do the things that a priest does.
That was when he went to see the witch of Endor, right?
That was, no, this was, there was a battle, and he wanted to get, an omen of, how the battle would go. And he was waiting around for Samuel, and Samuel wouldn't show up. And then eventually he takes matters into his own hands and starts, making offerings and doing incense so he can go to war. And Samuel comes along and is like, no, that's not what you're supposed to do. So yeah.
Now, it's also true, it's not just kings that aren't supposed to
Yeah.
do that. It's everybody else except the
Right. So there's a very set group of people, and they're kept at, the Hebrew word for holy, kadosh, can mean set apart. And the whole point of them being set apart perhaps is that then they wouldn't be kind of we would say the Supreme Court is they're appointed for life in order so that they wouldn't be in the Federalist Papers. The point is that so the Supreme Court wouldn't be swayed by political this way and that way, right? Wait, how much does that work out is another question. But that was at least the purpose of it, and perhaps the same thing was said of the priests. And of course, in the same way, right, the priests, especially around the time of Jesus, end up holding a lot of political power, which wasn't supposed to happen. But yeah, good. Next thing. Yeah. Now this is some interesting examples of where perhaps things are beginning that there's some kings who kind of transgress the boundary between king and priest, and it isn't punished. Can someone read? This is from 2 Samuel 6.
And David danced before the Lord with all his might, and David was wearing a linen ephod. And they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place, inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord.
Yeah, so David was, we know this story as David was dancing before God as the Ark of the Covenant came into Jerusalem. And the really weird part was that he was barely dressed. And that's what we were really afraid of. Now, but perhaps even more scandalous was that he was wearing a linen ephod, which is what a priest is supposed to wear. And so he was wearing this linen ephod and dancing as the ark was coming in. And so we saw, right, just earlier, right, where Saul, usurped the role of a priest, and that led him to lose his kingship. And part of the suspense of the following chapter, when God makes a covenant with David, is that we think for a little while that God is about to take David away from the kingship and take it away and say, like, you're not allowed to become king anymore. But instead, he promises you and your line will be kings forever, right? Someone read, this is Psalm 110.
The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You, the King of Israel, probably David, are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek.
So this is profoundly interesting because now we get to the book of Psalms, and it's calling you, right, so probably the king, are a priest, which is supposed to be a no-no, after the order of Melchizedek, right? So Melchizedek was a king and a priest, which was fine. So now this psalmist is saying this king, whoever it is, the rightful king of Israel, is in some sense also a priest as well, right? So there's some special kings in the Old Testament that are allowed, for whatever reason, to start to transgress the boundary between being a king and being a priest.
Now, obviously, David didn't write that song.
Probably not, yeah.
Yeah, that was good.
The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand, and I will make your enemies a footstool. So that's definitely written from like a third person perspective, yeah. Yeah, so the Torah or Old Testament generally prohibits kings from becoming priests, and nevertheless, there's certain special kings like David and Melchizedek who seem to transgress the boundary, and it's fine, right? Saul transgresses the boundary, it's really bad. David transgresses the boundary, and it's fine. Now, perhaps it's because like these kings are just so good, right? They're so just and so righteous that God is kind of fine with them doing the priest stuff every once in a while, right? So Melchizedek literally means the righteous king. Fair enough, right? We'll let him do it, right? I don't know. Now, this is an order of priests which is higher and older than the order of Aaron by like 1,000 years, right? So Melchizedek was doing his thing like 2000 BC. Aaron was doing his thing like 1200 BC. And so clearly, if it's older and it's higher, it includes kings. This is a better order of priests, even than the priests of Aaron, which was ordained by the Torah.
Actually, Psalm 110 is of David, it says in here.
Of David, right, but the word of is weird,
Okay.
right? So the word, when it says the Psalm of David, like of does a lot of work there because it could mean written by David, it could mean, about David, it could be written for David. Like there's a million different ways you could translate that same Psalm of. Even in English, like if you use the word of, a lot of times people are like, what does that really mean, Yeah. And perhaps this is even older than the covenant with Abram. Okay, so the intertestamental period, so this is the time between the Old Testament and New Testament, included a lot of speculation that Melchizedek might have been some kind of supernatural being. So Genesis gives him no genealogy, so we don't know where he came from. So maybe he didn't come from anywhere, right? Maybe he's an angel or something like that, and he wasn't born to anyone. And Psalm 110:4 says he's greater than Aaron, and he's even a priest forever, which means perhaps Melchizedek never died or never dies, is like supernatural in some way. So there's a lot of speculation between the Old and New Testaments about who Melchizedek is, even like we have speculation today about it. So 2 Enoch 71 is a really interesting chapter about the birth of Melchizedek. So Melchizedek's mother is found to be pregnant, even though she's really old. But she had not slept with her husband in a long time, which means that maybe she had cheated, right, on her husband, and then that led to her getting pregnant, even though she was really old. And his mother did not know the cause of her pregnancy, but his father shuns her. So she was pregnant. She didn't know where it came from, right? But his father, knowing that it's got to be, there's only one way that you get pregnant, was like, okay, this is obviously you cheated on me. I'm shunning you, right? So they set her, right, okay, so she dies. I skipped that part. She dies. But they set her aside to bury her, but come back to see that a child had came out of her womb, like acting like a 3-year-old and wearing priestly garments, which is crazy, right? Which means that, oh no, we screwed up and killed, right, this poor woman who actually was telling the truth because this is supernatural, like this is not supposed to happen. And is kind of like a virgin birth, right? Now, the dating of this is unknown. We don't know whether this was before, like the story of Jesus or after, right? So it's somewhere between like 100 BC and 100, 200 AD is Second Enoch 71. And so it might be, right, that this was influenced by the story of Jesus. But whatever the case, the fact that they chose Melchizedek for the story of the virgin birth means that they at least had this idea that Melchizedek was somehow supernatural.
You know, why would he be considered like supernatural and godly rather than demonic? Like, I think if something like that happened, I'd be like,
Yeah. Yeah. There's something wrong here. I mean, wearing the priestly garments is nice. And, I mean, obviously this is written in the background of Genesis 14 and Psalm 110, where Melchizedek is obviously a good guy. And so I suppose the characters in the story had no consideration of this. Obviously, this is likely not an historical, thing, but written, 2,000 years later. But
Sounds like a little Coptic news.
yeah, yeah.
Funny they just,
Can somebody read this as continuing from 2 Enoch 71?
and behold, Melchizedek will be the head of the 13 priests who existed before. And afterward, in the last generation, there will be another Melchizedek, the first of 12 priests. And the last will be the head of all, the great archpriest, the word and power of God, who will perform miracles greater and more glorious than all the previous ones. He, Melchizedek, will be priest and king in the place of Kuzan.
Which is another name for Jerusalem. Yeah. So there's even kind of a, eschatological, meaning having to do with the end times, focus for Melchizedek that perhaps he's going to return somehow or another, or his order will return somehow or another. And of course, because they believed that the Messianic king, was a priest in the order of Melchizedek, it would make sense, right, that he returns somehow or another in the form of the Messiah, right?
So could Melchizedek just be a title?
Yeah, the righteous king.
So every priest was Melchizedek?
In the same way, perhaps, that, every king is the son of David, right? Maybe the same idea could be, right? But there's an obvious, lineage, genetic or otherwise, right, that is kind of part of it as well. That it's referring to a very, very specific tradition as well, right? So even if it is a title in the same way that Messiah is a title, right, it's referring to this giant tradition as opposed to just saying, oh, it's a righteous king, Yeah. Any other thoughts? Okay. Go ahead.
What's bugging me is the timeline.
Right.
So all of this is occurring thousands of years before the birth of Christ.
Right.
How is Christ's birth affecting what we're doing?
How is Christ's birth affecting who is doing?
That whole idea about the priests and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
You're saying, it predates the coming of Christ, and maybe that's what's included. I'm just having a problem with the timeline.
Yeah. So I guess the idea is, and we're going to get to Hebrews later on, and kind of the point that Hebrews makes is that, you all, Jews in 68 AD or whatever, you all are worried about what might happen to the temple. You guys are worried about, making sure that all the Jewish rites are observed and everything like that. But instead, someone has come, Jesus, right, who belongs to an order that is so much older and so much better than even these, laudable Torah traditions that you are really concerned about, right? And if that's the case, don't worry so much if the temple's going to be destroyed, which it will be in 2 years, right? Don't worry so much if that's the case, because we belong to an order of kings and priests in Jesus Christ, which is so much better than the order of Aaron and the Levites and stuff, right? And that's older even, right? That belongs to something that's even thousands of years older than the Torah itself, right? Yeah. Okay. This is from Qumran. So Qumran is who created the Dead Sea Scrolls. So those were discovered in around 1948 and gave us an amazing new understanding of how the Bible was written and everything like that. It's wonderful. So this was a community of people who were okay, we're done with this whole Israelite society. No one's following the Torah. Everything's, they're radicals. They're these guys aren't doing enough. So they go to these caves by the Dead Sea and they create their own community that's set apart from all them. I guess the brethren kind of are a little similar than that. Yeah, the brethren, in the early days.
They lived in caves.
Yeah, they didn't live in caves, but they were set apart from the wider world, right? Whole thing. So in 11Q13, there's Melchizedek is like the super strong warrior angel, like Michael, who casts out these demons. And Belial, the archdemon, is named Melchi Rasha, so king of evil, whereas Melchizedek is the king of righteousness. And they're fighting against each other, and there's an obvious contrast between the two. So again, kind of like Melchizedek becomes an angel, kind of like Michael in some intertestamental literature. This is, of course, between like around 100 BC. Someone read 11Q Melchizedek.
You will assign them to the sons of heaven and to the inheritance of Melchizedek, who will return them there and will proclaim to them liberty, forgiving them all their iniquities. For this is the moment of the year of grace for Melchizedek. Belial and the spirits of his lot rebelled by turning away from the precepts of God to damage fragment. And Melchizedek will avenge the vengeance of the judgments of God.
Yeah, in like intertestamental Jewish literature, there's the idea that humans fell around the time, like we think of humans falling around the time of like Genesis 3 with the Garden of Eden and stuff. They would say like that was bad, but then it really, really, really got bad around the time of the flood, when like all kinds of demons taught people how to sin in different ways, like with like magic and stuff like that. And so there's like this tantalizing damaged fragment where they describe what the evil like demons were telling them to do, and then Melchizedek is fighting against them. So yeah, good. So Melchizedek begins to be seen instead of as just like this random enigmatic guy from Genesis 14, instead as the supernatural being. And as a priest and a very powerful king, he's kind of a prototype of the Messiah, who will also be a priest and king after his order, and will show up at the end of days. So Melchizedek, perhaps the actual Melchizedek, and perhaps someone after the order of Melchizedek, like Jesus, would show up at the end of days, right? Now, this made a lot of sense to the Qumran sect, because they thought that the Jerusalem priests were evil and corrupt and everything like that, which the New Testament kind of shows that they are. And so they wanted to, live separate from them, and they were looking to a better priesthood than the priesthood that's on offer in Jerusalem, right? So it kind of makes sense with their broader theology. The book of Hebrews, now, this is where we get to the New Testament, and this is the only place really where Melchizedek is mentioned. The book of Hebrews was written by an unknown author, most likely around 68 AD. So, because we know that Timothy was freed by the persecution of Nero by the time the book was written, but then also, right, the destruction of the temple in 70 AD would have fit perfectly within his argument, but it wasn't mentioned, which makes people think it probably didn't happen yet. So the main argument is that Jesus fulfills, improves on, and supersedes the Old Testament and Jewish religion. It's better, right? Jesus is better than all this old stuff. You don't need to worry about that stuff if it fades away, because Jesus is better, right? Therefore, you should follow Jesus and not slip back into comfortable Judaism, right? So at the time, right, Christians were persecuted because they were calling people to worship one God and one only and forsake their pagan gods. In a time when Jews were allowed to do that as long as they kept themselves, right? So they were kind of breaking this rule, and that was leading to them being persecuted. Well, it would have been so much easier if you just went back to Judaism and didn't worry about telling Gentiles the good news, because that's the only thing that's going to get you persecuted in the first place. And so that's what Hebrews is written to people who might be persecuted for telling Gentiles the good news. So Melchizedek ultimately becomes a major part of his argument, and so I think with what we've learned, we can kind of get an idea of what the writer of Hebrews is doing with the story of Melchizedek as well. Any thoughts or questions so far? Okay. Somebody read for this Melchizedek.
For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, that Abraham returned to slaughter of the kings and blessed him. And to him Abraham apportioned the 10th part of everything. He is first, by translation of his name, king of righteousness, and then he is also king of Salem, that is, king of peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever.
Yeah, any thoughts on those verses? Any things that start to make sense?
I think he's relating it to Jesus.
Right. Yeah, so he's a king and a priest, which should be a no-no, but if you have a righteous enough king, then maybe he can become a priest, right? Which is a major part of the argument of Hebrews, that Jesus is both prophet, priest, and king of this world, and that is what makes him special, right? Makes him better than all the others.
But then how does that twig up with Enoch, where Melchizedek jumps out of his mother's womb
Yeah.
at the age of 3?
Right, and it's questionable whether it's even been written, like, by this point, but it does. I think the reason why I brought that up is to show that, like, Melchizedek was seen as a super, super, super special guy by the time we get to the intertestamental period. Yeah. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. So if you just were reading the Bible, you'd be like, are you kidding me? You're getting this from just the fact that there's no genealogy of Melchizedek in Genesis? But if you think of it in terms of the broader Jewish tradition, it makes sense that he would say this, right? That he was a supernatural guy, because the whole Jewish tradition was saying that Melchizedek was a supernatural guy that perhaps returns at the end of days, right? Anything else? We see king of righteousness, king of peace. Makes sense. Good.
Well, how does Melchizedek then line up with Elion?
How in Hebrews or like?
Or just in because you were saying that Elion was a god or whatever
Mhm.
around what Canaanites or whatever.
Yeah.
I mean, is that what Abraham would have come into when he came from Ur and went to Canaan? Would then he have been worshiping Elion, Yahweh, or whatever?
Yeah, and so obviously at that point the boundary between the worship of Yahweh and the worship between El Elyon is very fuzzy. But at the very least it does, like, especially for like the writer of Hebrews, it does preserve a tradition of people who are worshiping God even before God revealed himself in the nation of Israel, in that people, right? Okay. Can someone read this passage?
See how great this man was, to whom Abraham, patriarch, gave a tenth of his spoils. And those descendants of Levi who received the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take the tithe from people, that is, for their brothers, though these are descendants from Abraham. But this man who does not have his descendants from them received tithes from Abraham, and blessed him who had the promises. It is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior.
Yeah. Any thoughts on those verses? What's the author's point?
This guy Melchizedek was superior to Abraham.
Yeah, even superior to Abraham, which is a wildly scandalous thing to say, and especially among a group of people who really did believe that they were God's only people, and that there was nobody could ever come to the same importance as they did in God's eyes. To say that actually people were worshiping God long before Abraham, and the worship of God didn't start in Israel, right, with Israel, and perhaps there's people that worship. It's completely reasonable to say that there's people who worship God outside of Israel, outside of the people, the Jews. Yeah, very good. And so basically saying that this is better, right? What you have signed up for in being a Christian is better than what you have on offer.
Where did that come from?
We're- Hebrews 7. Yeah,
Oh.
yeah. We're in Hebrews 7 just generally here. Good. Yeah, it is beyond dispute that the inferior Abraham is blessed by the superior Melchizedek. Okay, one more slide I think of scripture. Nope, two more. Okay, keep reading. Somebody want to read?
Now, if perfection had been attained through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need would there have been for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek? For the one whom these things are spoken belonged to another tribe, for which no one has ever served at all. descended from Judah, and in connection with that tribe, Moses said nothing about priests.
Okay, so we have this major problem, right? We want to say that Jesus is our priest because Jesus offered the perfect sacrifice that made us clean from our sins and washed our sins away, which is a lovely, wonderful thing. But then how can we say that Jesus is a priest if he doesn't come from the priestly line of Aaron or Levi? What is the answer that the book of Hebrews gives?
He's from the priesthood of Melchizedek.
Yeah, he comes from the order of Melchizedek, which is far better and far older and far more ancient than the line of Levi. Which means also that if the Torah created this priesthood, which is worse, than the order of Melchizedek, and it was only a pale shadow of what is to come, then we are living in something that is so much better, right? Great. One last slide on that scripture.
For it is indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, and exalted from above the heavens. He has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily. First for his own sins, and then for those of the people, since he did not once for all, or since he did this once for all when he offered himself up. For the law appoints men in their weakness as high priests, but the word of the oath, which came later than the law, appoints a son who has been made perfect forever.
Yeah, so the word to be made perfect is kind of a weird translation thing. So in Hebrew, the word to fill can be used for ordaining someone. So you fill the hand of the priest, and he's ordained as a priest. And then in Hebrew, that same word is teleo, which means to fulfill or something like that, which is great. But then it also has this weird Platonic meaning about being made perfect. And so there's a little bit of a translation issue there. So I would say to be made perfect means to be ordained forever as priest. So we heard about the Qumran sect, right, of priests who were or people who were okay, the priests are evil. We need to separate from them until God comes and sets this right. Would the writer of Hebrews agree with the Qumran sect about the status of the Jerusalem temple? Yes. Yeah. So they're led by human beings who have their own evil self-interests. And in fact, right, that's mentioned quite a bit in our scripture today, right? That these priests have their evil self-interests, but we have something so much better in Jesus himself, right? And so, for instance, the law that I might mess up as a pastor, right? But we have a priest and a pastor who's so much better than us in Jesus himself. Go ahead.
This is a little off topic, but isn't Qumran where the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Exactly. Yeah. That's the community of people who had the Dead Sea, who created the Dead Sea Scrolls. Yeah, great. Yeah, and so this is based on, so what this is saying, and this is Jeremiah 31, is that there's going to be a new covenant that's coming, right, where it's so much better because we have, we are actually enabled to actually fulfill the law as opposed to, Israel, which failed miserably to fulfill the law. And so this creates this new covenant, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing that we got through the resurrection. And in Hebrews 8:10-13 says, "And speaking of a new covenant like in Jeremiah 31, he makes the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away." And of course, within 2 years, this is what happened, right? This is the Arch of Titus in Rome, which shows the temple being sacked and all the implements from the temple being taken away. And what the writer of Hebrews was doing is preparing them for this and basically saying, don't be shocked when this happens. It's not going to be, what is old and obsolete is ready to pass away because we have a new and better covenant, which is mediated by Jesus himself, which we can actually obey and keep, and which brings blessings to the entire world instead of just Israel. And it was, enacted and started long before even the Torah, long before Genesis, right? Good. So what does this mean for us? One, Jesus is Savior, King, and Priest for all of humanity, going back even before Abraham. And this was always the plan, right? It was always the plan. Jesus was never plan B. He was always the plan, right? And it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. That God may even have been worshipped somewhere or another always, however imperfectly, right? It's so much better that we have Jesus, right? But maybe God accepted worship somehow or another from other people, right? And we don't need priests to make sacrifices on our behalf because we have one priest who is able to make one sacrifice for all himself, right? And then it was originally, I had written this for Epiphany, but the exclusivity of the covenant with Abraham has been replaced with the inclusion of Gentiles. And this has precedent, right? That God was worshipped before Abraham, before the Jewish people, and our priest comes from a order that comes from long before the Jewish people themselves. Good. Any thoughts or questions? Go ahead.
Okay, so this goes back a little bit, but in Hebrews, it makes the claim that Melchizedek has no lineage
Mhm.
and like no beginning or end, and that I forget what the other stuff was.
Right.
It says all that, and then in Second Enoch, it clearly depicts him having a mother,
Ah,
and like it depicts him being at the age of 3.
right.
Which is somewhat of a beginning.
Right.
Does the Bible just disregard Enoch as
Yeah. And it's basically like we don't know even whether the Book of Enoch like had existed by that time. No, the Bible definitely like at different points like or that at least that part of the Book of Enoch. The Bible definitely at certain points actually like kind of quotes or assumes that you know the books of Enoch. But at least in this point, like it's unsure whether that specific story about the virgin birth of Melchizedek had even been written by the time that Hebrews had been written. But we don't know.
She wasn't a virgin.
Right, I guess she wasn't a virgin, right?
Yeah, because she was married. She had a husband for
Right.
many, many years. It would be more like Elizabeth, who became
Yeah.
pregnant with
Except
John
that
the Baptist.
with Elizabeth, there's no there's indication that it happened like the normal way, just to like a really old person, whereas this
Still,
clearly didn't happen through the
divine
normal
grace
means.
intervened.
Right, anyway.
Let me put it that way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there you go.
Well, stories like that is why they didn't include it in the canon.
Sure. Yeah, and I think I don't think it's in the Catholic canon either. Where was I? Yeah, and I think the general idea, the gist of all that is just to say, like, people thought that Melchizedek was super special, right? And the exact, like, you know, and there were people from all different kinds of Jewish communities thought Melchizedek was super special. The specifics of exactly how he was special maybe is less important, but he definitely, between, 500 BC and the time of Jesus, people started to think he was super special. Yeah. Any thoughts? Any questions?
Well, but, I mean, you say that God, was worshipped before, but he still chose.
Right.
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 Yeah.
Which means that, the Jewish people 2000 BC to 0 AD or whatever to the time of Jesus, and always, even now, right, are very special, like wonderful thing. But the fact that, people worship God beforehand means that, God's relationship with humanity isn't contingent on Israel itself, right? Yeah.
But they were special in the sense that they were the final chosen people to bring about Jesus.
Right. For yeah, and then for the blessing of their covenant to go to the whole world. Yeah. Which was fulfilled. Yeah, exactly. Any other thoughts? Great.
He had